Excellent. Well, on the first day of the ISLA Festival 2015, I have the distinct privilege to be here with Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor Diarmaid Ferriter, historian, author, broadcaster, Professor of Modern History in University College Dublin, as we were just discussing, proud alumnus of St. Benilde's College. Tell me, Diarmaid, a little bit about your trajectory from your childhood up until the professorship. Has history always been something that's been part of your world?
I think you absorb a lot of it at home, depending on the kind of home that you grow up in. You know, there were always an awful lot of books in the house, and a lot of history books as well, which is where I would have had my appetite whetted, really.
Yeah.
You know, who are these characters? Why are these books here? You don't appreciate at that age maybe what some of those books might represent. Some of them might have been controversial. I remember one of the first books that I saw on my history shelves, of my parents' history shelves, was a biography of Patrick Pearse, and it was published in 1977 by Ruth Dudley Edwards.
Sure.
And when I got to read that, I thought, this is a fascinating man, fascinating era. I didn't appreciate at the time that had been a very controversial book when it came out, because it was a warts and all treatment of
the failure of
an icon, the triumph of failure.
The triumph of failure.
You know, an iconic Irish patriot who has been subjected to quite a critical analysis. And it's not a hatchet job by any means, though some felt it was. So that kind of thing you can absorb at home, or it just whets your appetite. But there's also, my parents were school teachers, and we spent a lot of the summers visiting all sorts of different historic sites.
Okay.
It was one of the things that they used to do. And you're talking about all sorts of round towers and museums and cemeteries. I was always fascinated by cemeteries. They got a bit worried about how long I used to stay in cemeteries, long after everybody else had gone. You know, I was fascinated by the dates and how long people had lived and when they had lived, and I did absorb a lot of that. But then I think when you go into school, you know, you find certain things that you're good at. You know, there was a lot of subjects I was not interested in, and I did tend to concentrate on English and history. And of course, the more I studied history and had interesting teachers, which is a huge help, obviously, the more I realised there's something more in this. That's not to say that when you're at that stage, when you're 13 or 14, that you decide you're going to be a historian. There was never any moment when I said, oh, I have to be a historian. Even going in doing an arts degree, again, I realised history was what I wanted to concentrate on, but it's not something that I thought would be future in relation to a career. I studied history as a single subject in second year in UCD in the early 1990s, and there were nearly 30 in that class, and I'm the only one as a professional historian, so an awful lot of people used it as a springboard to all sorts of other fascinating areas, and I'd always say an arts degree is brilliant for that. And they went into law, and they went into marketing, and they went into politics, and they went into a whole host of areas, media, broadcasting, all sorts of different areas, and history served them all well in the various areas that they went into. I ended up, of course, going over to the other side. Having been a student there, you then become the teacher, or you become the lecturer. So, in a sense, I grew up in UCD.
Did you notice that transformation happening? Did it sneak up on you?
Not at all. No, I mean, these things, particularly when you're a junior academic, you know, you're peripatetic. You're an itinerant historian. You know, you're going around to various institutions looking for bits and pieces of teaching and trying to get some teaching experience. You're also trying to get your first book published, you know, usually your PhD. I didn't do it. I never published my PhD because I got so fed up with it, because you can spend, you know, a couple of years very intensively engaged with something, and I was very young. I was only 22 or 3 at that stage, and I didn't think it was good enough, and it wasn't developed enough. And then, you know, I'd moved on to other subjects. I can never understand people who stay with the same historical subject for their careers. It's just not me. I don't have that endurance in relation to one particular theme. So I was always looking for something new, you know. So it gradually, it coincided with the release of an awful lot of new archival material. It was a very good time to go into history if you were interested in Irish history. You know, the idea that you could stay here and research 20th century Irish history, because an awful lot of the historians who came before me went off to Oxford, or they went off to Cambridge. That was the way things were done. You do perhaps your undergraduate, and then you were told to push off and, you know, get some specialise and preferably specialise abroad. And even now, there are a lot more graduates of the NUI system, or the Irish system, in lecturing posts in history than would have been the case in the previous generation, where it was very much a rite of passage to go off to Oxford or Cambridge and then come back, and you had served your time abroad.
Yeah, I'm going completely off subject now, but just exactly what you're saying reminds me of that wonderful Shaw quote that a specialist is somebody who researches more and more about less and less until he ends up knowing everything about nothing. You know, is there?
That's part of it, certainly. Now, I wouldn't dismiss those who have devoted a lifetime to a particular subject or even a particular individual, because some of them do extraordinary work. But I think it depends on your temperament and your mentality, and your way of approaching things. I mean, you mentioned broadcasting. A lot of what I have done over the years has involved, yes, the academic work and the research and the educational side of things, but there's also the public history side of things, where you're communicating to as wide an audience as you can. And you know, public history is now recognised as almost being a separate discipline. I never saw it as a separate discipline.
Yeah.
You know, particularly if you're being paid by the state to educate, you know, you can do that in a variety of different ways, and you can contribute in a variety of different ways. But you wouldn't be able to have that same kind of experience in media or in journalism or in wider communications if you were only specialising in one particular subject or one particular area.
Yeah. I want to ask you about judging Dev, which I read because my father told me to read it.
A wise man, your father.
We've yet to meet him. Such, you know, a very, very divisive figure, Eamon de Valera, and a very balanced book, I must say. But I want to specifically ask you, Tim Could never dig up anything on Juan de Valera. We're here in the Cervantes Institute. What, if anything, can you add to the Spanish or Hispanic background of Eamon de Valera's father?
I can't, and that was very, very deliberate. When I set out on this project, one of the things I was determined was that it would not become a book known for that.
Right. Was
De Valera illegitimate? You know, what was the Spanish connection? One of his enemies famously labelled him the Spanish onion in the Irish stew.
Yeah.
And you know, there was a lot of muckraking. It was done quietly enough most of the time, but the issue there is evidence, hard evidence. You know,
or the lack thereof,
or the lack of it. And you can't make assertions, you know, if you don't have the evidence to back them up, though plenty of people have done that. But I didn't want that book to become about that issue.
True.
Because one of the reasons I was so drawn towards the study of De Valera was because of his exceptional longevity in politics and his exceptional longevity in life. 1882 all the way up to 1973 or to 1975. And he was in public life from 1913 to 1973. It's extraordinary. It's incredible. And it can never happen again because of the way politics is now. So I wanted the book to be about what that meant.
Yeah.
You know, what was politics for that generation and for that individual about, rather than getting caught up in controversy about his parentage. I think it was a very important aspect of his life, because his childhood and the way things panned out, and there may have been feelings of abandonment, and that did affect him in all sorts of different ways. Sure. But there was no point in me pretending I could psychoanalyze him. Yeah. So I didn't really want to dwell too much on that. That book is very much about De Valera's public life. It's not about his private life. I mean, there are elements of his private life that come in. I found his correspondence with his wife, for example, was fascinating, and they had a very, very long marriage, and she was a very formidable woman. Mm-hmm. We tend to think of De Valera's Ireland as involving a particular De Valeran type woman, and certainly he is associated with articulating a particular
Sure.
vision. But you know, when you come across a character like Sinead, then you realise there's a hell of a lot more going on.
Yeah.
So that was part of it, but most of it was about his public life and the impact that he made. And the reason I also did it was because his archive had become available, extraordinarily voluminous archive, and that had been put together very carefully over many, many years, you know, and you have to be careful about that also, because there, you know, De Valera had a particular strong sense. He writes as early as 1923, the Civil War. This archive is important, you know, and he's writing to people, in the event of my incarceration, make sure these papers are kept. And, but then what's kept and what's not kept, you know, you have to think about that also. But, you know, the Dev project was also about presenting history in a particular way and allowing people to look at the primary sources to read the original documents. And yes, I had to make my own judgment. That was the title of the book, Judging Dev. But at the same time, as you are well aware, De Valera is so divisive a figure that people have all sorts of judgments about him. And I did hope there was a degree of balance that could come with time. I'm not carrying any baggage in relation to De Valera. You know, I mean, historians, of course, are affected by the environment that they work in and that they grow up in. But I felt enough time had passed because, you know, it was nearly 40 years after the death of De Valera. And you begin to think, particularly for a historian like me who was kind of trained under a system that we call the 30-year rule. You know, wait till 30 years has passed before you can try and put things into historical perspective. It's the same term that applies to the release, say, of state papers.
Sure.
So I thought, right, maybe enough time has passed for there to be an approach to De Valera that's not grounded in Civil War politics, because a lot of the history that was written about those figures was a kind of an extension of the Civil War through the writing of history books. And there tended to be quite a black and white approach on both sides. So I felt enough time had passed to get away from that approach.
It's interesting because I wanted to ask you about the subject of historical fiction from the perspective of your profession. You talk about archives, you talk about evidence. You know, what is the responsibility of a fiction writer when it comes to writing about historical events?
None whatsoever.
Good.
They're fiction writers. And I don't believe in any snobbery on the part of the historian. I remember, in relation to 1916, reading Peter de Ross's Rebels, which was rip-roaring yarn, you know, but very, very well done. And, you know, very invigorating in all sorts of ways. What's the point in the historian coming along as a snob to a work of fiction that doesn't pretend to be a work of non-fiction and say, well, that's not true or that's not true? You know, there are those who writing historical fiction can do a lot of research and really do their homework and do their contextualization, and they can do a terrific job. But first and foremost, their imperative is that of fiction writing. I mentioned Brian Friel earlier on, Brian Friel, who died today, and it's extraordinary that this morning, when I was preparing what I was going to say tonight, I had a section on Brian Friel, and then discovered a couple of hours later that he had died this morning. And I was always interested in how he approached this, because it's not just about novels, it's also about playwrights, because he was very conscious of his own background, his own heritage, and how he might bring drama to that. Look at Dancing at Lunacer, for example, which is very much based on the experiences of his aunts and the stories that he had told and the memories of that and how you might deal with it. But you have to adapt it. And he made the point that if there was a conflict between the historical fact and the fiction that he was engaged in, or the project he was engaged in, it was the narrative that won out. So he wasn't going to allow the historical facts to hem him in. And he's perfectly entitled to do that. You know, what writers have to worry about is the sentence, and the next sentence, and the next sentence. So if those who are writing historical fiction feel that they have to keep coming back to the evidence and it's going to constrain them in some way, well, then that's not going to do justice to their own creativity. Sure.
But I've always believed that there must be, I mean, I don't know if you know the book Underworld by Don DeLillo, incredible book. I don't think it could be possible to get a better feeling of post-war America or what the Cold War was than from that book. I don't think there's I don't think there's a history book that could summate it.
But you see, I've always made that point that historians should embrace historical fiction, and they should embrace drama to illustrate various different eras or points that they are trying to make. It doesn't mean that those accounts contain historical veracity. You know, there's no account that is the definitive version anyway, but they add texture. And they add feeling, and they can add things that historians just sometimes cannot manage. You know, and I think that's why they really can be a great addition to history writing and history research, you know. So you can have, it's a point I was making earlier on, you know, you can have the documents that might tell you what happened, but what did it feel like? We often have to go to poetry, or to song, or to prose, or to fiction, to try and get that sense of what it felt like. So you're getting a different version, but that's very, very relevant to the era that you are trying to do justice to as a historian.
I always feel that, you know, there are certain examples that just untangle complications from a narrative, from a fictional point of view, much better than any historical document. There's a wonderful play by a Chilean Ariel Dorfman called Death and the Maiden, that deals with post-dictatorship Chile, and very clearly interrogates the need to remember versus the need to forget. Which we can connect with in terms of the Peace and Reconciliation Committee in the North. What about that? What it's the historian's bread and butter: documentation, archives. What about that need to forget? What about that need to forgive history, to forgive the past?
Well, you can't move on, to use that phrase or that description, unless you engage with the past, unless you confront the past. If you want to forget, it's much easier to forget if you have acknowledged and understand and have researched what happened.
Yeah.
And we will often hear about, in the modern era, including in our own country, about conflict resolution, peace studies, about the idea of letting go of the past. And that can be a very, very important dynamic in healing, but it's also hugely difficult.
Sure.
Because you are asking people, of course, to excise a certain part of their experience or their community's experience. And if you go now to a place like Derry, for example, and the vividness of the murals, the wall murals that commemorate Free Derry from 1968 and 1969, at the beginnings of the Troubles, there's no way they are going to allow those events to be forgotten. And they've actually become a tourist attraction now in certain parts of Northern Ireland. And they're not going to forget, and in a very, very deliberate way. That doesn't mean you can't move on. They're not incompatible. The idea that because there are these constant reminders of the past that you can't move on. You can move on. It can be very, very slow and it can be very, very difficult, but you don't have to move on by letting go of the past. You actually have to confront it. And I think they're doing that in very, very difficult circumstances, because an awful lot of the issues that were relevant to the conflict are still very, very much there. Certain things have changed, but you're dealing with very, very deep-rooted anxieties and conflicts and divisions. So, the idea of forgetting, or the idea of letting go so we can move on, I don't think it's credible. And even when you're looking at people who were affected in the worst kind of ways, they're carrying that all of their lives. And, how can they move on, or how can they forget? Of course, you can talk about time and the passage of time, and of course that is, as the cliche goes, the great healer. But you're talking about, a very, very long time. So, I mean, it's not, obviously, the historian, first and foremost, is going to talk about the need to understand and the need to get as full a picture as possible of what happened. And if you're talking about a healing process, or even if you're talking about a process of forgetting, you still have to have that knowledge in the first place. And
then, of course, there's celebration. The next time we have our festival, the next time we have the ISLA Festival, Ireland will be 100 years old, or at least the Declaration of an Irish Republic will be 100 years old. Where are you going to celebrate it? What are you going to do?
I think I'll leave the country. I'm not going to be celebrating, and I don't mean that in any denigratory way.
Sure.
What I'll probably be doing is the same thing that I've always been doing, of course, which is to try and put some kind of context on this. The question that will be asked so many times next year: what did it mean? What does it represent? What motivated or propelled those who were involved in it? How has our understanding of it changed? All of those kind of questions we're going to be dealing with. You can talk about commemoration or celebration. You can talk about an uncritical approach to 1916, or you can talk about reevaluation and revising and new information and new perspectives. Throw them all into the mix. They're all relevant. I mean, politics produces a particular type of commemoration that responds to the needs of the time, to the needs of the political class a lot of the time. It's very different from history. Commemoration and history are often the enemy of each other. So there has to be, I think, a sense that there can be obviously formal state commemorations, and then you have people who would be planning all sorts of things at local level, and they're entitled to do that because it belongs to them and the commemoration belongs to them, and they need and want to remember things in a particular way, and good luck to them. But the historian also has to, continue to do what they always do, which is remind people that we have to remember evidence, we have to remember context, we have to try and understand 1916 through the prism of 1916 insofar as we can, whilst at the same time being alive to hijacking and propaganda and simplifications and distortions. And commemoration is capable of producing all of those negative things as well as positive things, because people can be hugely empowered and enlightened. That's a positive aspect of commemoration. They get very interested in perhaps their own family's experiences, or they get very interested in learning more. And thankfully we have a hell of a lot more information about 1916 now to equip them in that learning, and that can be very positive. So there's all of those things have to be thrown into the melting pot of commemorating 1916. So in relation to where I'll be or what I'll be doing, they're the kinds of thing,
straight back to work,
doing,
like Brian Field.
Yeah, but it's also it's very enjoyable work. And again, it goes back to this question of public history. And what is public history, and the degree to which you find yourself as a historian in a very privileged position, because there's a huge interest in history in this country. And historians from other countries have said it to me on numerous occasions, that they don't quite find the same level of intense engagement that they get in Ireland.
Sure.
And so you're in a very privileged position. But there's also the question then of the historian being the party pooper when it comes to commemoration, because they keep dragging it back to the history as opposed to the commemoration. But that has always gone on. Even when we talk about the generation of 1916, they would, when they were younger, some of them, they would have experienced commemorations that were relevant to their own time and to their own particular era. If you take the centenary of the 1798 rebellion, that would have occurred in 1898. Many of them are coming to adulthood at that time, and they're being brought into politics, or they're being brought into commemoration. So commemoration at different stages has performed a very important function for a whole host of different reasons and for a whole host of people. So commemoration in itself is a shaping force and is a historical force. So there is an opportunity, of course, to look at it in that much broader way. And then there's the question, of course, of how a state should approach it. There's a determination, I think, for pride not to be bullied out of existence for reasons that might be considered politically correct reasons, that you can't be commemorating violence, that you can't be having military parades, or you can't be reburying dead patriots because you're emphasizing the role of violence in history, and look at all the damage that has done.
Sure.
But that's not the answer to it either, because you have to look back and see where we have come from and how did we get there and what was involved in that. And there's an awful lot of difficult stuff there, and top of the list is death and violence. 7,500 people were killed in Ireland as a result of political violence between 1916 and 1923. So, you have to deal with that, and you have to deal with the legacies of that. And of course 1916 is important because it began a process that ultimately evolved into a civil war by 1923. So, what you would hope is that 1916 is not seen in glorious isolation, that it's seen as part of a very complex and multi-layered story.
Well, if you feel privileged doing the work, then Ireland is doubly privileged that we have so lucid a historian, so important a historian. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much for speaking with us, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.